Hello, everybody. My name is Xavier Moore. I'm your host for today. Welcome to episode 3 of Inside EMIT, and I am here with.
Aaron Stemo.
So, Aaron Stemo, let me ask you some questions if you don't mind me asking.
Absolutely.
Where are you from?
I am originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, actually. But
Yeah.
I've been around a little bit, around the whole country. But that's where I grew up.
Yep. You're from the cold, up north, if I'm right.
Yeah. It is cold. Yeah. You get used to it, I guess.
You get really used to it.
You know what I don't get used to is Nashville weather. It's too hot here.
That's the same. It's too humid.
Yeah,
compared to where we're from.
Sorry, it's not the heat, it's some humidity.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Okay. Another question. What made you want to come to Vanderbilt?
That's a great question. Well, it really was like to work with Jesse Renault and do the science that I'm doing here, right? So I'm a postdoctoral fellow. So it's a little bit different than being a student in that, I essentially applied for jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So I picked places that I wanted to actually work, who had interesting, essentially calls for applications for people to do research with them. And Jesse had one that was doing really interesting work, and I applied. And I was like, here's what I have done, and here's what, I will do with you. And she seemed to like it. So I came here to that job. In general, I enjoy Vanderbilt for a lot of different reasons. But I came here because I've heard good things about the department and because of who I'm working with.
Okay. That sounds super interesting. With that being the case, what made you want to go into what you're going into now, though?
That's a very good question. It's almost like a lot of people are like, oh, I've always wanted to do this one thing. I feel like I've kind of stumbled slowly into what I'm doing currently. It's almost like I'm discovering like my path or the character I am instead of like having like a written outline that I'm following kind of thing. So with that, as a child in public school, all throughout, I was like, oh, I'm pretty decent at math and I enjoy science because I like solving problems or understanding how like these complex systems work, right?
Mm-hmm.
You kind of really, if you're doing science class, you really get that almost the ability of like, here's this weird thing. How does that work? We're going to tell you how it works, right? So I really enjoyed that in school. And then after that, it was kind of like, what do I want to do to further this? And I was like, and then 18-year-old me was like, well, I have to make money. So I'm like, I'll do engineering because it uses math and like some of those science skills, but then you also make money. So I wanted to do that, but then I ended up not actually going to undergrad at that time. Instead, I joined the military because I really just didn't have the money to go to school, actually. So I was in the military for a few years, and then when I went back to school after that, I was like, I don't care anymore about making money. And now I'm just going to do what I actually find interesting. So I was like, I'm going to actually study like physics. So I was like, I'm going to study physics and math. And then doing a little bit of physics and math, I was like, actually like astronomy, which is, it's kind of its own thing at this point, but it's almost like also a subfield of physics. So it's this idea of like all these different physics subfields you can do. And I'm like, well, actually space is really interesting. Black holes are really interesting, or like really large structure of the universe is really interesting. So I eventually kind of slowly moved towards that in undergrad, and then in grad school, I went to Colorado for astrophysics, and I worked with a lovely advisor, Julie Comerford, who does a lot of things about like galaxy evolution and coevolution with supermassive black holes at their centers. So I started working on that, and it's really interesting. I've always loved that. So I did that like during my PhD, for my PhD work, and then I came here and I'm doing, it's like always like just one minor step. It's always just one small step that gets you to the next thing. So with Jesse, it's kind of like I shifted into this, instead of looking at these really big galaxies and supermassive black holes, now it's almost like looking at slightly smaller galaxies. We call them like dwarf galaxies, or, like something a little bit smaller than the Milky Way. And instead of supermassive black holes, they have massive black holes at their centers. They're just not as big, essentially, because it's a smaller galaxy. And we're still looking at mergers, but instead now we're looking at things that have to do with when the black holes themselves merge. And kind of just the way I got here is really just all those small steps following curiosity and interest, really. It's just like, that's really what it was.
That just gave me a question in my mind, too. Like, if two black holes merge, do they become a super black hole?
They can. But the thing is, think about this. With astronomy, we there's so many scales and size that we talk about like orders of magnitude, which is like powers of 10. Like we're like, unless you change by a factor of 10, do you really change that much? So it's like when two black holes merge, just imagine they're both the same size, like almost like the biggest you can get, because otherwise you're talking about just a bigger one absorbing a smaller one, if that makes sense.
You're right. No, yes.
So imagine they're two the same size, you doubled in size, which is almost the same as one of this. Like instead of doubling, you're like, it's not increasing by a factor of 2 in astronomy, actually not that much usually, which is just really interesting thing. Because when we're talking about massive black holes versus supermassive black holes, we're talking about things that are like 1,000 times bigger. Yeah, so
to put into perspective.
Yeah. So these things do get bigger over really long time scales, but like any one thing, it usually is just a little jump. And by a little, I mean it's big, but like in cosmic terms, it's not huge by itself.
That's actually really interesting. I love so much stuff about space, to the point where I love hearing explanations on it. I think for me, there's a few questions I would like to ask. What advice would you give to students who want to go into this field and who have a passion for it?
Yeah, what would I say? Well, what I would say was, think about what your long-term goals are. That's always what you should be doing, because once you finish undergrad, and even like going to undergrad should be a well thought out choice. But I think it's also the idea of like going to undergrad, period. I'm a big proponent that general education is just good. Undergraduate level education, where you kind of get breadth, is good for everybody. I really do think that. People shouldn't be going in debt to do it, but I think it's a good idea. But once you get past that into really more advanced education, it really is the idea of like, why am I doing this? Don't just do it for no reason. It's like, do you have a purpose in doing it? So like, it's like, I did have curiosity, but I didn't only do it for the curiosity. I also did because like, I'd really be interested in
a
career, right? Of doing something similar to this. So it's like, I would love to be a faculty member someday, mostly because I enjoy teaching and I enjoy mentoring and I enjoy solving these astrophysical problems. So that's like kind of the job mostly for faculty. Other things that you can do in the field as like a career is like be something called a research scientist. So it's mostly the research, not really, no teaching pretty much, and maybe not as much mentoring, right? So there's a little bit different thing. If you get a PhD in physics or astrophysics, you can also just do purely pretty much teaching. It's called like teaching faculty, where you're primarily teaching, maybe doing a little bit of your own research and a little bit of mentoring, but mostly teaching. And then you can also do other things with it, outside of that completely. There's plenty of other different offshoots within academia still. You can go into like astronomy education or like observatory type management of like, how do we create planetarium and engage shows, science communication. All these things are options, right? But then make sure to balance it with the idea of like, what does the field look like? How available are those jobs? Are those something I really want to do long term? And then think also, there's a lot of options outside of academia too, right? You can do the skills we get in astronomy are very useful for things not in astronomy, right? You can obviously do things that like our science telescopes aren't the only thing in space. Right? So we have skills that are useful to pretty much anything that goes into space, usually. But besides that, we have skills that are easily transferable over to other things like financial analysis, data science, computer programming. These are all things that you kind of have very, very similar skill sets to, and you can really just apply those to other things. So to wrap this up, sorry, that was a long answer. What would I say to people wanting to do this? If you have a lot of interest, and it really aligns with what you want to do long term, do it, right? But both those things should be true.
Okay. You just taught me something for when I go to get my master's. Okay. Another question. What are your hobbies? What is things that you like to personally do that gives you enjoyment?
Yeah. Let's see. I have 2 dogs and a cat, which aren't hobbies, but they're lovely, and I do love playing with them, so I got to bring them up. I like playing board games with friends or just with my partner. I like going on hikes, watching TV or reading books, obviously. And I also really enjoy playing Dungeons & Dragons with my friends or other tabletop role-playing games in general. But Dungeons & Dragons is currently what we're playing. 3.5 for the hardcore technical number junkies. Not my choice, but I did find it to be very fun so far. But I do that weekly, and it's super fun. I'd say it is the peak of my week, but maybe not like, I'm not saying I really enjoy obviously spending time with my girlfriend, my dogs and such, and like reading and all the other things, but like in the condensed hours I play with my friends D&D per week, can't replace that. It's great.
That sounds so fun as someone who just got into their first match of D&D.
It's real fun.
I can see why you enjoy it so much, especially with the right group of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
So with that being the case, I guess one of my last questions, and this is just personally for myself, for someone who wants to come to Vanderbilt, what advice would you give them, as in like when it comes to coming onto the campus itself?
Into Vanderbilt itself?
Yeah.
Let's see. This is such a hard question for me because I'm inherently going to want to compare. And I don't know if that's that useful for people who haven't, if you're talking about people like for going to undergrad, it's kind of like, what do you have to compare to? Going into undergrad at Vanderbilt, I'd say like suggestions for anybody going to undergrad. Be ready. A lot of the stuff you're going to do is going to be essentially social stuff. It's going to be learning how to socialize well, being independent, in addition to managing a pretty intensive workload alongside trying to manage yourself, all your own finances, all your own housekeeping, all those things, right? That's true for anybody, first of all. Anybody leaving their house, it's going to be true for anybody. But that's really important. But let's see, for graduate students, I'd say coming to Vanderbilt, I would say, as an astrophysics, for example, undergrad, or maybe physics, the Vanderbilt department's actually really, really good. I really enjoy it. It's a really good group of people. The grad students are really welcoming, really great. We have a good set of people, kind of like, a diverse set a group of people so it feels like everybody could find their own, everybody kind of fits in, or there's always somebody that kind of has some similar interests, or feels like they resemble you in some fashion usually. And of course, we have the EMIT program, which honestly, I think is the first time we've said that in this interview. The EMIT program, which is really great, honestly. So I'm a part of that, and I think it's a really, really great, resource here and a team to join at Vanderbilt. Multi-messenger astronomy, which is kind of a lot of what it does, is really, really kind of just getting off its feet. And what I mean by that is like, we've been doing it for like 10 or 15 years, but it's kind of been still really, really niche. And it's finally getting to the point where it's becoming more and more of a thing that is, the idea of multi-messenger astronomy is something that is going to expand into a lot of, any field that could possibly do it will start trying to do it, right? Because it just is so useful as a skill. So, it really teaches people those skills. And as they do it, they bring you even into like another community that really welcoming and teaches you, the skills that go along with that. I think it's really great.
Yeah, I was just about to add on to that. Like, coming into this program, hearing that it's somewhat new in the terms of how like it's been getting funded. It's somewhat new through Vanderbilt for the last, I believe, 2 years, they said.
Yeah.
And just being a part of the family, even just for someone who's not even in astrophysics, people are so nice to explain how it works, to explain how space is working, like how much of it have we explored, what goes on through it. And I find that it's such a great program for schools such as Vanderbilt. And even now with EMIT starting to go towards other schools to try to get students to come join it, even if you're not a part of Vanderbilt, it's so great to me to get knowledge shouldn't be kept.
Yeah.
It should be expanded.
Absolutely.
And
that's a key part of that.
And I love that the EMIT program is doing that as a whole. And I love to be a part of it. Obviously, if y'all see us doing this interview. But with that, I believe those are all the questions that I have for you today. I do really want to thank you for being a guest on our show. And, keep on doing
Twice.
Twice.
We had technical difficulties.
This is the recapture, But definitely, I thank you. And for anybody who's looking for our Instagram, it'll be in the description below, as well as with my YouTube channel, if y'all are personally interested in me. And with that being the case, thank you for coming to Inside of Me.
Thank you.